The honourable member for Dartmouth, Cole Harbour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to get up and speak for a few moments this evening about this important piece of legislation. I'm somewhat confused, perhaps, by the response from members opposite when they say a couple of things. They say that this is a common-sense way to deal with a number of problems. By introducing 70 changes, an omnibus bill that changes 70 important pieces of legislation. Common sense approach to dealing with some important matters, that it's simply a way of growing the economy, creating jobs, and moving this country forward, and that a lot of the changes that they've introduced in this legislation are important changes and that they will benefit the country, and they're very proud of them. But what I can't get over, if that in fact is the case, then why don't they take some time to consider each one of those changes? Because, for example, when you look at the changes to the employment insurance system that are contained in this bill, none other than the 4 Atlantic premiers have come out in the last few days, and they've said, we have very serious concerns about the changes that are being proposed in this legislation. We have not been consulted, and we would like to examine those. Mr. Speaker, even today we've talked a lot in this House over the past number of weeks about the changes to the Fisheries Act, and contrary to what one member said opposite, many of us have looked at the bill. Many of us have examined the changes that have been made and have listened to a number of experts who have given consideration to what the impacts will be. As recently as this afternoon, before the Fisheries Committee, the Great Lakes Fisheries Commission came before our committee to talk about invasive species, and they spoke to a resolution that had been passed and forwarded to the Prime Minister and to the Minister of Fisheries by the advisory committee to that commission, asking that the government engage in further consultation on the changes to the Fisheries Act, and failing that they recognize that the definition of fisheries habitat that they've used is completely and utterly inadequate, and they suggested additional language in order to do that. That doesn't sound to me like people that are affected, that are understanding or being supportive of these changes, Mr. Speaker. So what is confusing me and confusing many Canadians that are being directly affected by this legislation is why this government, if they're as proud as they say they are about the changes that they're trying to implement, why is it they don't take time to talk with Canadians about what they're proposing to do and make sure that everybody is on board? But unfortunately, what we've seen over the past number of weeks is the government hell-bent on getting this legislation through, and in fact what they are trying to prevent is Canadians actually seeing what's in the bill and understanding what's here. The government talks, the member before me spoke glowingly about the changes to EI, the changes to the temporary foreign workers program, and the changes to the Fair Wages Act, and how this was going to help employees. What they're doing with those 3 changes alone is they're driving down the wages of working people in this country so they won't be able to afford to purchase goods and services in our communities. How in the name of heaven is that supporting the economy? In Atlantic Canada or in that member's own constituency? I'd like him to give that some consideration, Mr. Speaker. I was on the subcommittee of the Finance Committee, Standing Committee on Finance, that considered this bill, C-38, that considered the 70 pieces of legislation that were being affected, and we had 14 hours, that's it, 14 hours to consider the Employment Insurance changes, the Fisheries Act changes. The Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, Mr. Speaker, is completely repealed in this bill, completely repealed and replaced in Bill C-38. And we had 14 hours to examine, to listen to representations by Canadian experts, by people who were directly affected by this legislation. And these people came before us and they told us what they thought about it. They told us how the bill would affect them, would affect the issues that they're interested in. They brought their expertise before us, Mr. Speaker, and I got to tell you that it was, on the one hand, revealing, and I learned a great deal by both those that supported the legislation and those that were opposed to the legislation. But what concerned me the most as a parliamentarian and as someone that has some experience in legislation and dealing with these matters, Mr. Speaker, I was disgusted, frankly, at the dismissive way that these witnesses, many of them, were dealt with. Members opposite, members of the government side, Mr. Speaker, challenged anyone that raised any questions with what it was. They treated them poorly. And in fact, if you look at the subcommittee's report that was tabled in this House, when the Finance Committee reported back to this House, you will see a report that is nowhere near reflective of the testimony that we heard in those 14 hours, Mr. Speaker. Let me give you one example. The Grand Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, Chief Atleo, came before our committee and he told us in no uncertain terms how upset he was and his people were with the fact that they had not been consulted, that the government had completely ignored the duty to accommodate, the duty to consult that has been reaffirmed in Supreme Court decisions over the past 20 years, and that the changes that are being proposed in a number of pieces of legislation does not consider the role that the First Nations play in this country, and that it creates extraordinary hardship and will create extraordinary damage to many of the things that the First Nations people in this country hold dear. Now, do you see that, Mr. Speaker? Do you see that sentiment reflected in the subcommittee's report? Not a word. Grand Chief Atleo's testimony is not even referred to once in the subcommittee's report. How can that be? We're talking about the Assembly of First Nations that represents over 600 First Nations communities in this country. First Nations, Mr. Speaker, who have rights, treaty rights, constitutional rights that have been defined by and confirmed by the Supreme Court. He is not even reflected. His testimony and the concerns of the First Nations people in this country are not even reflected once in that report. And I am submitting that. Members opposite are laughing. They think this is a great joke. But let me tell you, as a member of this chamber, I am thoroughly embarrassed and disgusted with the way that this matter has been handled. It is so disrespectful of the people that have taken their time to come before us and to provide testimony. It's like anyone that disagrees with this government, whether it's a member of the National Roundtable on the Environment or on the Economy, or whether it's Grand Chief Sean Atleo, or whether it's members that came before us today of the Great Lakes Fishery Commission, if they have any objection with this government, they'll shout them down, they'll rule them out, they won't include them in their reports. It's shameful behavior, Mr. Speaker, and I'm telling you, Canadians are paying attention, and they're not going to stand for this. They're not going to stand for being railroaded by this government.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of the Environment.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, for acknowledging me. The member opposite spoke about the National Roundtable for the Environment. I had the opportunity to be with the environment critic for the NDP on a television panel earlier this month, and she, when asked by the host if she could name a report which she's used or found useful from the National Roundtable that did not involve a carbon tax, she could not name one, and I was wondering if my colleague opposite could do so.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth Cole Harbour.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the fact that the member that asked the question clearly didn't pay any attention to what I spent 10 minutes talking about here, nor did she, frankly, spend a whole lot of time paying attention to the representations in the subcommittee. In fact, when anybody was at all critical of her government, that member went out of her way to abuse, to disrespect people that made representations that came before this House and, frankly, performed in a manner that is below contempt, as far as I'm concerned, for a member of Parliament. And I was completely and utterly discouraged and disgusted by that behaviour, Mr. Speaker.